Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling a really significant shift in international trade. These new U.S. import tariffs announced just yesterday, April 2nd, 2025, by Donald Trump.
Yeah, quite the announcement.
Definitely. And you've shared a, fascinating collection of articles in your own notes with us.
Yeah.
So our goal today is to sort of cut through the noise, pull out what really matters. We want you to walk away with a clear grasp of these tariffs, what they are, and what the potential fallout could be.
Absolutely. What your sources lay out is it's a pretty dramatic reshaping of trade policy, and the context is just as important as the specifics, I think.
Right.
This announcement, which Trump's actually calling Liberation Day, it clearly signals a move towards a much more assertive approach to trade.
Liberation Day.
Yeah, and it's aiming squarely at reducing those persistent trade deficits and trying to bring manufacturing back to the U.S.
Okay, let's try and unpack this then, starting with the big picture. The overall tariff structure. It sounds like there are maybe two key phases to this.
That's right. The first phase, and this kicks in really soon, April 5th, 2025, it's a blanket 10% tariff on practically all goods coming into the United States.
Wow, okay. 10% across the board.
Pretty much. When they say practically all, your sources emphasize they really mean it. It's a very broad stroke.
Practically all goods.
Yeah.
That's a game changer, isn't it? So if you're buying anything from overseas, like raw materials for factories or, stuff on store shelves, you're likely looking at this initial 10% bump.
That's the expectation, yeah. Then things get more targeted just a few days later on April 9th.
Okay.
That's when higher, what are being called reciprocal tariffs, are set to hit imports from roughly 60 countries.
60. Okay.
Yeah, these are the nations that the U.S. administration believes engage in unfair trade practices or maybe already have higher tariffs in place on American goods.
Huh. That term reciprocal is interesting here. So the idea is that the U.S. is essentially responding in kind, like mirroring the tariffs these countries already impose on American products.
That's the stated intention, yes, to create a more symmetrical tariff landscape. The administration is framing this as a necessary step to achieve fairer trade relationships,
Right.
arguing that these higher tariffs are a direct response to existing disadvantages faced by, American exporters.
Now, our sources give us some specific details on how this breaks down by country. Canada and Mexico seem to have a slightly different situation going on.
They do. Your information indicates that Canada and Mexico are generally already facing 25% tariffs.
Oh, right.
These stem from previous executive orders related to border security and the fentanyl issue, so that's sort of already in place.
Okay.
However, there's a notable exception highlighted in your materials, Canadian Energy Resources. Apparently, they'll be subject just to the baseline 10% tariff.
Ah, okay.
Yeah.
So an energy carve-out for Canada.
Yeah.
That's definitely worth noting. And then we have this list of around 60 countries facing these higher reciprocal tariffs starting April 9th. Some of the rates mentioned are pretty significant.
They really are.
The EU at 20%, China, wow, 54%. That's the highest.
That's the highest listed, yes.
Then Vietnam, 46%, Thailand, 36%, Japan, 24%, Cambodia, 49%, South Africa, 30%, and Taiwan, 32%. I mean, those are substantial increases.
They are indeed. And as your sources point out, the justification consistently comes back to this idea of reciprocity. The aim is to mirror the duties these nations levy on goods coming from the United States.
Right.
What's fascinating here, and it really underscores the magnitude of this policy, is just the breadth of countries affected and the scale of some of these tariff hikes, particularly on, major global economies like China and the EU.
It definitely signals a really assertive, maybe even aggressive shift in how the U.S. views and conducts international trade. So let's delve into the why behind all of this.
Yep.
What were the key drivers and justifications outlined in your sources?
Well, the primary rationale, and it's repeatedly emphasized by Trump, according to your sources, is the need to address the persistent and, frankly, substantial U.S. goods trade deficits, which, as your materials note, were over $1 trillion in 2024.
Over $1 trillion.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. Beyond that, there are concerns cited about a perceived lack of fairness or, reciprocity in existing trade agreements, allegations of currency manipulation by some nations, and also the impact of foreign value-added taxes.
Foreign value-added taxes, VATs.
Yeah.
Okay, for someone who might not be familiar, what exactly are those, and how do they play into this rationale?
That's a good point. Value-added taxes are basically consumption taxes. They're added to the price of goods and services at each stage of production and distribution.
Okay.
And the argument being made is that these VATs, which are really common in many other countries, they can give foreign producers a price advantage when they're selling into the U.S. market because the U.S. doesn't have a similar nationwide consumption tax like that.
Okay, right. That clarifies that point. And what about the legal foundation for these pretty sweeping measures? Our sources mention a specific piece of legislation being invoked.
Yes, the administration has declared a national emergency under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, often just called IEPA.
IEPA.
As your sources indicate, this act, which is typically invoked in response to, significant national security or economic crises, it grants the president very broad authority to regulate international commerce.
So they're framing the trade situation as an emergency.
It's essentially, yes. The administration is arguing that the persistent trade deficit and what they deem as unfair trade practices constitute such a crisis, justifying the use of IEPA.
Right, and the language surrounding this announcement, as you touched on earlier, was quite striking. Liberation Day, and the assertion that the U.S. has been looted, pillaged, raped, and plundered by other nations. I mean, that paints a very strong picture of the administration's perspective.
It certainly does. Very strong language.
Did any of your sources analyze the intended effect of that kind of framing? Was it meant to, galvanize domestic support or signal a firm stance to trading partners, or maybe something else entirely?
That's a crucial question. While the immediate effect is certainly to grab attention and underscore the administration's conviction, some of your sources do suggest the likely aim is rallying domestic support, portraying the U.S. as a victim of unfair global trade. That kind of rhetoric can be very effective in mobilizing a specific segment of the population. And of course, it also serves as a very clear signal to trading partners of a much, much tougher negotiating stance.
It certainly does. Okay, so we have the tariffs themselves, the affected countries, the rationale rooted in trade deficits, and this perceived lack of fairness. Now, let's shift to what many people are worried about, the potential consequences. What do your sources tell us about the anticipated economic and global impacts?
Right. This is where the discussion gets really complex, and your sources reflect a range of perspectives and potential outcomes. It's not clear-cut. On one hand, proponents, as mentioned in your materials, argue that these tariffs will indeed stimulate a resurgence in U.S. manufacturing. The idea is making imported goods more expensive levels the playing field for domestic producers.
That's the core argument, right?
Yeah.
Make American goods more competitive by increasing the cost of the foreign alternatives.
Exactly. However, your sources also highlight some pretty significant concerns and potential downsides. A primary worry across multiple analyses is the likelihood of higher consumer prices for a vast array of imported goods. This could effectively increase the cost of living for American households.
And that price increase wouldn't necessarily be limited to, say, luxury goods, but could affect everyday necessities as well.
Precisely. Your groceries, your clothes, electronics, a lot could be affected. Furthermore, your sources point to the potential impact on U.S. industries that heavily rely on imported components and materials.
Like which ones?
Think about the automotive sector, electronics. They use parts from all over the world. Increased costs for these inputs could lead to higher prices for the final products for consumers, or maybe just reduced profitability for those businesses, which could impact jobs.
Right. Okay, so domestic impacts, higher prices, potential industry disruption. What about beyond the U.S. borders? What are the expected international repercussions highlighted in your sources?
Well, there's widespread concern about global market instability and negative reactions from the countries being targeted by these higher tariffs.
Predictably.
Yeah. As you mentioned earlier, we've already seen reports of threats of retaliation, particularly from major economic players like China and the European Union.
And the fear, of course, is that this could escalate, right, into a full-blown global trade war, with countries maybe engaging in tit-for-tat tariff increases.
Exactly. That's the big worry.
Your sources even reference research suggesting the potential for significant negative consequences from trade wars like that, including, reduced GDP and job losses. I think there was a mention of analysis from the Tax Foundation in some of the material you shared.
Yes. Several of your sources allude to research, including analysis from groups like the Tax Foundation, that examined the impact of previous tariff implementations.
And what did they find?
The general conclusion from those studies was that broad-based tariffs can have negative effects on overall economic growth and employment, even within the country imposing them.
Oh, interesting. Why is that?
Well, mostly due to the increased costs for businesses and consumers, which can dampen demand and investment. It sort of ripples through the economy.
So while the intention might be to bolster domestic industries, the interconnected nature of the global economy means there's a real risk of unintended negative consequences that could, potentially, outweigh any potential benefits.
That's a key takeaway from your sources, yes. The global supply chain is incredibly intricate. Imposing significant tariffs can disrupt established relationships and create new costs that are ultimately borne by businesses and, consumers.
Right.
And we're already seeing immediate reactions internationally. Your sources mentioned reports of South Korea ordering emergency support for industries they anticipate will be negatively impacted by these new U.S. tariffs.
Already? Wow.
Yeah, it suggests a broader expectation of economic disruption beyond just the countries directly targeted with the highest rates.
It really paints a picture of a very complex and potentially volatile situation.
Mm-hmm.
The economic impact isn't a simple calculation, is it?
Hmm.
It's clearly a subject of significant debate and concern among experts.
Absolutely. While the stated goals are focused on domestic benefits, the interconnectedness of the global economy means that such sweeping measures can trigger a cascade of reactions and consequences that are just really difficult to predict with certainty.
Okay, so to summarize our deep dive into this significant trade development, on April 2nd, 2025, the U.S. announced new import tariffs. There's a baseline 10% on almost all goods, effective April 5th, and then higher reciprocal tariffs on around 60 countries, starting April 9th. Canada and Mexico face generally higher existing tariffs, but there's that exception for Canadian energy. The rationale centers on addressing substantial trade deficits and a perceived lack of fair trade practices.
Right, using IEPA as the legal tool.
Exactly. However, your sources raise serious concerns about potential economic downsides, including increased costs for American consumers, disruptions to industries relying on imports, and the significant risk of retaliatory measures, potentially leading to a global trade war with negative consequences for everyone involved.
That's a concise and accurate overview of the key aspects highlighted in your sources. It's definitely a policy shift with potentially far-reaching implications for the global economic landscape.
And that brings us to our final thought for you, our listener. Reflect on the intricate web of the global economy. A policy change as significant as these new tariffs, while rooted in national objectives, inevitably sends ripples across the world, doesn't it?
It really does.
It sparks responses and could potentially reshape international trade relationships for years to come. So maybe think about what might be some of the less obvious secondary effects of these tariffs in the coming months and years? Not just for the U.S. and its major trading partners, but maybe for smaller economies or even just the overall stability of the global trading system.
Yeah, what are those knock-on effects? It's definitely a development with many, many layers to consider.